Before there was Canada, before borders or flags, there was land. Ancient, endless, carved by glaciers, rivers, and time. This land carried stories long before Europeans drew maps. Stories of peoples who understood its rhythms, who walked its forests, paddled its rivers, hunted its plains, and prayed to its skies. Archaeologists tell us that humans have lived here for over 12,000 years. But Indigenous voices remind us, we were always here. From the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the east, to the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, the Blackfoot of the Plains, to the Inuit of the Arctic. Each nation carried its own language, its own laws, its own creation stories. The land was not empty, it was alive, and it shaped nations more enduring than any European empire. In the year 1000, Norse voyagers from Greenland landed on the shores of what is now Newfoundland. They called it Vinland. Archaeological remains at L'Anse aux Meadows prove the Vikings came, built, and left. They were the first Europeans to touch this land, but they did not stay. To the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq, these strangers were an encounter, not a conquest. And when the Norse disappeared, the land remained indigenous, untouched by Europe for centuries more. But the silence would not last. By the late 15th century, the age of exploration began. Their sails signaled a new era, one of alliances, trade, and eventually, conquest. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec. To Europeans, it was a foothold. To Indigenous nations, it was a new partner, and sometimes a new threat. The fur trade transformed lives. Beaver pelts became as valuable as gold in Paris. French traders relied on Indigenous knowledge to survive winters, navigate rivers, and trap animals. In return, guns, cloth, and iron tools changed Indigenous economies. But trade was not neutral. It brought disease. Entire nations fell to epidemics. Where once tens of thousands thrived, smallpox left villages empty. At the same time, alliances pulled nations into Europe's wars. The Huron allied with the French. The Haudenosaunee often sided with the British. Indigenous lands became battlegrounds for European rivalries. The land was still alive, but its balance was shifting. By the 18th century, France and Britain waged global wars for empire. And in North America, Canada was the prize. The French built forts, spread Catholic missions, and married into Indigenous alliances. The British pushed from the Atlantic seaboard, bringing settlers by the tens of thousands. Their rivalry was inevitable. In 1759, on the cliffs of Quebec, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham decided the fate of Canada. Both generals died. The French surrendered. And 4 years later, the Treaty of Paris ceded New France to Britain. The fleur-de-lis came down. The Union Jack rose. But for Indigenous nations, this was no victory. They had not fought for crowns in Europe. They had fought for their lands. And in 1763, Britain's proclamation tried to limit settler expansion into Indigenous territory. But settlers came anyway. Promises made in ink would be broken in blood. After 1763, French Canada became a conquered province. Catholic priests negotiated survival. Farmers clung to their seigneuries. Britain imposed new laws, new rulers, new expectations. Yet the French remained. Their language endured. Their faith endured. And slowly, they became a permanent puzzle inside the British Empire. Meanwhile, Indigenous nations resisted. Pontiac's rebellion in 1763 shook British confidence. The message was clear. This land was not empty. It belonged to nations who would not be erased quietly. When the American colonies revolted in 1776, Canada became a haven for Loyalists. More than 40,000 refugees, British soldiers, families, enslaved people promised freedom, fled north. They carved new towns along the St. Lawrence and the Maritimes. These Loyalists carried more than baggage. They carried an idea that Canada could be something separate, something not American. Out of revolution to the south grew the seeds of a Canadian identity. Not independent yet, but different. July 1st, 1867. 4 colonies joined hands. A new dominion was born under Britain's crown. They called it Canada. It was not yet a nation, more a fragile compromise, but its leaders dreamed it could stretch from sea to sea.
We are a great country, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and we will build it together.
But Confederation was also exclusion. Indigenous nations were not invited. Women had no vote. Black communities, Chinese workers, and Métis leaders were never consulted. Canada was born in compromise, but also in silence. The dream of Canada was a railway, a steel thread to bind provinces and open the West. Tens of thousands labored. Irish immigrants, Scottish stonemasons, Chinese workers paid half wages and buried in unmarked graves. For every mile of track, blood was spilled. The railway was more than transport. It was conquest. Treaties signed under pressure forced Indigenous nations onto reserves. The buffalo lifeblood of the plains were slaughtered to near extinction. Métis resistance under Louis Riel ended in execution. The rails bound Canada together, but they also tore nations apart. The price of Canada's expansion was Indigenous dispossession. In Quebec, the French survived conquest, but outside Quebec, their culture was under siege. In Manitoba, new laws stripped French-language schools. Priests, parents, teachers resisted, but English was forced as the language of power. These conflicts planted a deeper seed, the idea that French identity was not safe in Canada, that Quebec was not just a province, but a nation within a nation, a tension that would never disappear. In 1914, Canada marched into war as Britain's colony. Over 600,000 enlisted. At Vimy Ridge in 1917, Canadian divisions fought together for the first time. Against all odds, they took the ridge, a feat even the French and British had failed. The ground shook under us, men fell all around, but still we climbed. When the ridge was ours, we knew. We were no longer just colonials, we were Canadians. Vimy became a symbol. Canada shed blood not as Britain's child, but as a nation. The 1930s brought collapse. Crops withered, factories shut. 1 in 4 Canadians was unemployed. Families walked roads looking for work. Hunger haunted cities. Dust storms buried farms. Desperation grew. Workers organized. Strikes erupted. The On to Ottawa trek was crushed in violence. Out of despair, new ideas rose: social security, pensions, public health care. Canada's compassion was forged in crisis. In 1939, war came again. Over 1 million Canadians served. Women filled factories. Indigenous volunteers fought abroad while their rights were denied at home. Canada became an arsenal of democracy, building ships, planes, and tanks. At Juno Beach, Canadians stormed ashore on D-Day. They held ground where others faltered. The cost was heavy, but Canada proved itself on the world stage. By 1945, it emerged not as a colony, but as a middle power with a voice in shaping the post-war world. War destroyed, but it also transformed. Canada was no longer just Britain's shadow. It was something new, something still unfinished, something fragile, but alive. The end of World War II brought prosperity. The baby boom filled classrooms. Highways spread like veins across the land. For the first time, millions owned homes with televisions glowing at night. But prosperity was not only for those born here. A new Canada was opening its doors. Immigration reshaped the nation. Italians, Greeks, Portuguese, Caribbeans, South Asians, Chinese, each wave adding new colors to Canada's fabric. Refugees arrived from Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, Vietnam in the 1970s. With every arrival, Canada's idea of itself shifted, no longer just French and English, but something broader.
We came with nothing but hope. Canada gave us work, a house, a future for our children, but we also brought our music, our food, our voices. Canada became home, but also became us.
In the 1960s, Quebec changed almost overnight. For centuries, the Catholic Church had dominated schools, hospitals, and politics. But in one decade, faith gave way to modernity. They called it the Quiet Revolution. And it was anything but quiet. The state took over education, healthcare, and hydroelectric power. French Canadians demanded control of their own economy, once dominated by English-speaking elites. A new pride was born Quebecois, not simply French Canadians.
It is not enough to survive. We must master our house. Nous devons être maîtres chez nous.
But with pride came tension. Some dreamed of independence. The FLQ crisis in 1970 saw kidnappings and bombs. The army marched in. For the first time in modern history, war measures were declared in peacetime. Fear filled the streets of Montreal. The quiet revolution gave Quebec a new voice, but it also shook Canada to its core. In 1968, Canada found a new star. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, intellectual, charismatic, controversial, he promised a just society and brought Canada onto the world stage. Under him, Canada would adopt official bilingualism, but also something more revolutionary, multiculturalism. In 1971, Canada became the first country to declare multiculturalism as official policy. No longer would immigrants be expected to melt into one identity. They could keep their culture while still being Canadian. It was radical, and it became central to the Canadian experiment. And then came 1982. The Constitution was patriated from Britain. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was born. With it, Canadians were guaranteed freedom of expression, equality, language rights. For many, this was Canada's true Independence Day.
I see Canada as a mosaic, a place where every tile retains its color, and together they form a picture of beauty.
In 1988, Canada signed free trade with the United States. It tied Canada's economy closer to its neighbor than ever before. Factories flourished, then faltered. Globalization brought wealth and dislocation. Meanwhile, Indigenous nations began reclaiming their voices. The Oka crisis in 1990, sparked by a golf course expansion on Mohawk land, forced Canadians to confront Indigenous rights long denied. It was not the last confrontation. From Idle No More to Wet'suwet'en blockades, the cry was clear. This land was never ceded.
We are still here. We never surrendered. Canada must hear us.
Twice, Quebec nearly left Canada. In 1980, the dream of sovereignty was rejected. In 1995, the country stood on a knife's edge. The no side won by barely 1%, one more vote in 100, and Canada might have fractured. Canada survived, but unity remained fragile. The new millennium brought new challenges. Canada fought in Afghanistan, its longest war. At home, it welcomed refugees from Syria and immigrants from every corner of the globe. Toronto became one of the most diverse cities in the world. Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, mosaics of humanity. But shadows remained. Residential schools, where Indigenous children were taken, stripped of language, culture, and too often life, left scars across generations. In 2021, unmarked graves were found. Canada could no longer look away.
We were told to forget who we were, but we remember, and now so will Canada.
Canada is not finished. It is not perfect. It is a story still being written, in classrooms and courtrooms, in protests and parades, in hockey rinks and sacred ceremonies. From the roar of Niagara to the quiet of Arctic snow, this land holds many voices. And together, they are Canada. Anada's history is not a monument carved in stone. It is a river, still flowing. The question is not where it came from. The question is, where will it go next?